Hello and welcome to our first lesson on early Latin phonology. My name is Giuseppe Pezzini and I teach and research on early Latin language and literature at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Today I will mainly talk about the phoneme system of early Latin, while also introducing some phonological changes, processes and variants attested in early Latin. Syllabification, prosody and accentuation will be discussed in the second lesson on phonology. Before I delve into my topic, I want to stress two important points. First, most of the phonological features of early Latin, which we will analyze today, are attested at all stages of the history of Latin. That is, we may say they are typical of Latin phonology in general. Given the constraints of time, I won't be able to repeat this point all the times for each of the features I will discuss. Second, there are some features indeed that are instead only or at least mainly attested in early Latin, but these features are often not the only ones attested. They occur together, at times in the same text, in the same author, with other more classical features. Early Latin was a period marked by a degree of linguistic anarchy. In the absence of a strictly codified grammar, user could choose between different forms of pronunciations of the same phonological entity according to factors related to context of use, social class, style, genre, metrical suitability, fashion, or even just fancy. This kind of linguistic anarchy is not only typical of early Latin, it's found, if you want, in the whole history of the Latin language, but it is certainly an important trait of the early Latin language. I think we are ready to start. In addition to the above plosives, early Latin also featured three aspirated voiceless plosives. The sound P, spelled as either P or PH, the sound T, spelled either as T or TH, and the sound K, spelled as C or CH. These were not original Latin sounds, but except in some few cases, they were all imported from Greek phonology and used for Greek lexical borrowings in a period which was marked, as I said in the first class, by a massive process of Greek enculturation. In the first stages of the early period, these aspirated sounds were represented in writing by the corresponding non-aspirated graphemes, like P, T or C, as suggested by some spellings actually attested. However, by the end of the 2nd century BC, aspirated graphemes PH, TH and CH are also well attested in inscriptions and sometimes extended to Latin words which did not have aspiration, like ancora with CH. Besides plosives, early Latin had two nasal phonemes, the labial M and the dental N, a rhotic R, something like that, and the lateral liquid L, appearing in two allophones. In addition, early Latin had two fricatives, the labiodental F and the sibilant S, which were always voiceless in early Latin. That's an important point. There was an intervocalic voice sibilant Z, which can be reconstructed in the early stages of Latin, but it disappeared by the early 4th century BC by the phenomenon which is known as rhotacism, according to which all intervocalic S became R. Early Latin also had two important semiconsonants, Y, spelled as I, and W, spelled as U. All early Latin consonants could be found geminated with phonemic value, but it is not before the mid-2nd century BC that gemination is also standardly represented in the spelling, with the exception of semiconsonant Y, which intervocalic is always geminated in pronunciation but is not found in the spelling. Inscriptions before the 3rd century BC and also some later inscriptions dating even to the early 1st century BC display the degeminated spelling, only one consonant, even if in pronunciation were certainly two. A very famous example is the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus of 184 BC, in which all double consonants are spelled as single consonants. It is not even impossible that it was Greek spelling itself which served as a model, since the very first attestation of a geminated consonant is found in a Greek borrowing found in an inscription of 201 BC. As in most languages, in early Latin, consonants were exposed to a vast range of phonological simplification, especially when appearing in consonant cluster. This is also reflected in some cases in the spelling. Among these, I can mention in particular the loss of the sound N before S, that is, consul is a standard, consul or console are the standard spelling for the word consul, and this loss of N presumably resulted in the nasalization of the preceding vowel. A second important phonological change is the velar pronunciation of N before a velar sound, and we know that also because the spelling with GC is attested in some text. There are also a vast range of consonantal assimilation, especially for nasal fricatives L and R, and also the word end consonants were exposed to simplification or loss. Typical feature of early Latin is the disappearance of the old endings in final D of the ablatives and the loss of final S before a following consonant, and we now call this sigmatic eclipses. In the final part of the early phonemic table, I may also list the grapheme H, which however already in early Latin did not represent any sound. It was also only used in some artificial speech in imitation of the Greek. And there were some authors like Lucilius who make fun of people who would use aspiration in their speech. There are finally two consonantal sounds which deserve to be mentioned. These are double consonantal sounds, the sound x and the sound z, or zd or z. We are not really sure about the pronunciation of this. Both of these sounds were derived from Greek, the former x as a mere graphical loan to represent the Latin cluster k, s, the latter z, instead merely to render in writing the corresponding Greek phoneme. Interestingly, in some early description, the phoneme z in Greek is realized either as s or as double s. I will now move on to the vowel system. Early Latin had a typologically common system with 5 short vowels, a, e, I, o, u, a, e, I, o, u in the writing, and 5 corresponding long vowels. I have excluded the letter Y, which was not native to Latin, and inscription is only rarely attested to represent the sound of the upsilon in Greek borrowings. The distinction between long and short vowels had an important phonemic value, but was not normally represented in the spelling. Although in early Latin sources we do find some experiments in this sense, to do with the vowels what early Latin did eventually with consonants. The most important of these experiments consist in the spelling of long vowels, and A especially, as geminated vowels. This is a practice which is attested in some inscriptions dating especially to the second half of the 2nd century BC. It is even attributed to a literary author, the poet Accius. Other experiments are the practice to use epixes to mark double vowels. That's an example from an inscription 104 BC, or the use of a sort of long I to mark long E. As you can see from that description, the long I in felici, both of them long. Apart from the standard phonemic vowels, which I've listed in the triangle, early Latin had a number of other vowel sounds which normally represented the intermediary stages in the phonological development of the language. A very important one, the first one in the slide, was described by ancient sources as a sort of middle sound, an intermediate vowel between the I and the U, between the E and the U, a sort of more fronted variant of a short U, symbolized by some scholars with those two symbols. The middle sound is reflected by the variety in spelling in forms such as Optimus and Optimus, or Maximus and Maximus, which is in fact attested in all through the history of Latin. There are some trends of standardization even in early Latin, but in general, both spellings are attested down to the late antiquity. Another important sound, more typical of early Latin phonology, is the long E, spelled as E, a sort of intermediate vowel between E and E, which represents the stage between the diphthong A and was monophthongized into E, a long E. Monophthongization is an important language change still undergoing in early Latin. Many diphthongs were possible in early Latin, but all of these were exposed to a process of vocalic simplification and ultimately monophthongization, according to the patterns that you see in the slide. All these diphthongs and their developments are attested in early Latin. Some of them gather in the early stages of the period, like for instance the spelling OU, for what is then monophthongized into a single U sound. Others instead are found all across the period. It is quite difficult to give precise dates, but it seems likely that by the end of the period, all the final forms in the sequence had become well established, at least in the spoken language. Monophthongization is not the only vocalic change attested in early Latin. The whole history of prehistoric Latin language is characterized by a process of vowel weakening related to tonic factors. Many of these phenomena were completed before the early period, but others are still in operation and produced optional variants. Among these I can refer in particular, number 1, to the closure of O into U and of E into I in final syllables. For instance, if you remember the description from the rostrum had quintio probavit, but the spelling with U, quintus, and I, probavit, is also attested in later early inscriptions. Second phenomenon is the change of O into U before a consonantal cluster beginning with L, like the doublet volt into volt. You can see that here I've spelled this sound with a V instead of with a U. This is just a convention. In early Latin there was not a particular graphem to spell this labiovelar sound. In this particular lecture I have used the more conventional spelling V found in some modern editions, but my colleague Wolfgang de Mello, I know that he will do it in a different way. A third phenomenon will be the change of U into I in initial syllable before L and labial, and in early Latin we find doublets, libet and lubet. I think it is now time to end our class. In the next class I will focus on syllables, prosody and accentuation. Thank you very much, thanks for listening, and gratias tibi or vobis ago.